Jonathan Adams had it all: a billion-dollar tech empire, a penthouse that scraped the clouds, and a wife, Lillian, whose quiet grace was the envy of their social circle. But ambition is a hungry beast. He threw it all away for a firestorm of passion with his brilliant, ruthless protégé, Maureen Carter. The night he told Lillian he was leaving, he never imagined the secret she held, a new life growing inside her. He walked away, convincing himself it was a clean break, a necessary sacrifice for a more thrilling future. Months later, haunted by a silence he couldn't explain, he would find himself standing in the doorway of her new, humble life, his heart stopping as he saw her motionless on the sofa. In that single, terrifying moment, the millionaire who had everything realized he had truly lost it all. The click of the penthouse door was a sound Lillian Brooks had learned to interpret. There was the 10 p.m. click, tired but triumphant, when a deal was closed. There was the 1 a.m. click, heavy with exhaustion and the faint scent of whiskey after a board meeting had gone south. Tonight's 8:30 p.m. click was different. It was hesitant, almost guilty. Jonathan Adams shrugged off his custom-tailored jacket, the fabric whispering of wealth he'd earned with relentless, single-minded focus. He loosened his silk tie, his movements mechanical. "Long day," he murmured, not quite meeting her eyes as he walked past her, toward the sprawling, floor-to-ceiling windows that overlooked the city's glittering expanse. "I kept dinner warm," Lillian said softly, her voice a gentle counterpoint to the city's hum. She'd made his favorite, osso buco, a slow braised dish that had taken her all afternoon. The aroma filled their cavernous, minimalist home, a space designed by a famous architect to be impressive, not comfortable. It felt like living in a museum. "Not hungry," he said, his back still to her. Lillian's heart did a familiar, painful squeeze. For months, it had been like this. He was a ghost in their own home, physically present, but emotionally a million miles away. He'd built his company, Nexus Innovations, from a garage startup into a global behemoth. But the man she married, the passionate, driven dreamer who'd sketch ideas on napkins, had been replaced by this cold, distant CEO. She'd given up her own promising career as an art curator to support his dream, a choice she'd made with an open heart. Now she felt like just another one of his assets, polished and maintained, but rarely appreciated. She smoothed a hand over her stomach, a nervous habit she'd developed recently. She had a secret, a fragile, beautiful hope she believed could bridge the chasm that had opened between them. She just needed the right moment. The right moment, Lillian decided, would be Saturday. Jonathan had promised, a rare, solid promise, that they would have the entire day to themselves. No calls, no emails, no emergencies. Just them. On Friday morning, after he'd left for the office in a chauffeured town car, Lillian stood in the marble-clad bathroom, her heart thundering against her ribs. She stared at the small plastic stick on the counter. 2 pink lines, bold, clear, and undeniable. A sob of pure joy escaped her lips. Tears streamed down her face, but these were happy tears, the kind she hadn't shed in years. A baby. Their baby. This was it. This was the anchor they needed, the miracle that would remind Jonathan of the life they had sworn to build together. It would be more than just Nexus Innovations and stock prices. It would be a family. She spent the entire day in a giddy haze. She bought a tiny pair of white booties and a small, elegant gift box. She planned a perfect evening, a simple, home-cooked meal, their favorite music, and then she would give him the box. She imagined his surprise, the flicker of shock in his deep blue eyes, giving way to a slow, brilliant smile. The real smile she missed so dearly. She pictured him wrapping his arms around her, holding her tight, his hand resting protectively over the new life she carried. This wouldn't just fix things, it would remake them. It would bring him home. For good. Saturday arrived, but Jonathan was late. An hour passed, then 2. Lillian's carefully prepared risotto grew cold on the stove. The candles she'd lit began to melt into puddles of wax. The hopeful energy in the apartment slowly fizzled into the familiar ache of disappointment. When he finally walked in, close to 10 p.m., he looked haggard. But there was something else in his eyes, too. A strange resolve that made her stomach clench with a fear that had nothing to do with her pregnancy. "John, is everything okay?" she asked, her voice small. He didn't answer immediately. He walked over to the bar and poured himself a scotch, his hand shaking slightly. He downed it in one go before turning to face her. The look on his face was one she'd never seen before. A chilling mixture of pity and finality. "Lillian, we need to talk," he began, the words a cliché that landed like a punch. "I haven't been fair to you. For a long time now." She stood frozen, the little gift box feeling impossibly heavy in her hands. "What are you talking about?" He took a deep breath. "I'm in love with someone else." The words hung in the air, sucking all the oxygen from the room. Lillian felt the floor tilt beneath her feet. It couldn't be real. This was a nightmare. "What?" she whispered. "Her name is Maureen Carter," he continued, his voice devoid of emotion, as if he were discussing a business merger. "She's the head of my R&D department. She understands my world. She understands me. We've been seeing each other for 6 months. 6 months. A timeline of deceit overlaid itself onto her memories. The late nights, the business trips, the emotional distance. It all clicked into place with horrifying clarity. "No," she said, shaking her head in disbelief. "No, Jonathan, you can't." "I'm sorry, Lillian. I truly am. But I can't live a lie anymore," he said, his voice firming up, any flicker of regret extinguished by his decision. "I want a divorce." The word divorce shattered the last of her composure. Her legs gave out, and she sank onto one of the ridiculously expensive, uncomfortable sofas. The small gift box fell from her lap, landing on the plush rug with a soft thud. Jonathan's eyes flickered down to it, but his expression remained unchanged. "A divorce?" she echoed, her voice cracking. "Jonathan, we built this life together. I gave up everything for you." "I know," he said, and the placid acknowledgement was somehow worse than an argument. "And I'll make sure you're taken care of. You'll be very comfortable. My lawyer will be in touch." He spoke of their marriage, their shared history, as if it were a severance package. The coldness of it was a physical blow, a desperate, primal need to make him see, to make him understand what he was throwing away, surged through her. "You don't understand," she sobbed, her hands instinctively going to her stomach. "You can't do this. Not now." She looked up at him, her eyes pleading. "Jonathan, I'm pregnant." For the first time, his mask of control cracked. Shock widened his eyes. "What?" "I'm pregnant," she repeated, her voice gaining a sliver of strength. "I was going to tell you tonight. That's what's in the box." He stared at her, then at her stomach, and a dark, ugly suspicion twisted his features. "Pregnant? You're telling me this now?" He let out a short, incredulous laugh that held no humor. "Lillian, is this some kind of game? Are you trying to trap me?" The accusation was so vile, so far from the truth, that it knocked the breath from her lungs. He didn't see a miracle. He saw a tactic. He didn't see their child. He saw a chain. The love she thought was buried deep within him wasn't just buried. It was gone. In its place was this cruel, suspicious stranger. "It changes nothing," he said, his voice like ice. He was rebuilding his walls, reinforcing his decision. It's better this way. I won't bring a child into a loveless home. He turned and walked toward the door, not even glancing back at the tiny gift box on the floor, the symbol of their shattered future. The door clicked shut behind him, and this time, Lillian knew what it meant. It was the final click, the end of everything. Alone in the cavernous silence, she let out a raw, wounded cry that was swallowed by the indifferent luxury of the home that was no longer hers. The days that followed were a blur of grey. The penthouse, once a symbol of success, became a prison of memories. Every corner held a ghost of the life she thought she had. The expensive art on the walls, pieces she had lovingly curated, now seemed to mock her. Jonathan was gone. He'd sent a courier for his essential belongings, a sterile and impersonal transaction that underscored his departure. His lawyer, a woman with a sympathetic but firm demeanor, had been in touch. The divorce papers were being drafted. Lillian felt herself adrift in a sea of grief and shock. For 2 days, she barely moved from the sofa, the same spot where her world had imploded. Then, a key turned in the lock. It wasn't Jonathan. It was Chloe, her best friend, her face etched with worry. "Lil, your phone's been off. I was so scared," Chloe said, rushing to her side and wrapping her in a fierce hug. The simple act of human contact broke the dam. Lillian collapsed into her friend's arms, sobbing uncontrollably. She poured out the whole sordid story. The affair, the cold confession, the cruel accusation. Chloe listened, her expression hardening with fury at Jonathan. "That absolute bastard," Chloe seethed. "To do that to you. And now, when you're pregnant—" She held Lillian at arm's length. "Okay, that's it. Operation Phoenix begins now. We are rising from these designer ashes." Chloe's pragmatic energy was the lifeline Lillian needed. First, she made Lillian eat. Then, she helped her pack. Not everything, just the things that mattered. Her books, her personal art, photos of her family, the few sentimental items that predated Jonathan. They left the designer clothes, the expensive jewelry, the soulless furniture. "You don't need any of this," Chloe stated, gesturing around the opulent apartment. "This is his cage, not your home." With Chloe's help, Lillian found a small, 2-bedroom apartment in a quiet, tree-lined neighborhood miles away from the heartless glitter of downtown. It was modest, with old hardwood floors and big windows that let in the afternoon sun. It was the kind of place she could have afforded on her old curator's salary. It felt real. As she signed the lease, using the emergency savings she'd always kept separate, she felt the first flicker of agency she'd had in a decade. She was terrified, but she was no longer just a victim of Jonathan's choices. She was making her own. The day she moved out of the penthouse for good, she didn't look back. Jonathan Adams dove headfirst into his new life with Maureen Carter, treating it like a corporate takeover. He moved her into a sleek, modern condo, even more audacious than the one he'd shared with Lillian. It was all glass and steel, a testament to a future unburdened by the past. He bought her extravagant gifts, a rare diamond necklace, a cherry-red sports car, a weekend trip to Paris on a private jet. The business journals and gossip columns lapped it up, painting him as a titan of industry, with a love life as bold as his business ventures. Maureen was everything Lillian wasn't. She was fierce, ambitious, and utterly consumed by the world of power and success they now shared. Their conversations were about market disruption and quarterly earnings. Their passion was a volatile, high-stakes game that mirrored the boardroom. In the beginning, it was intoxicating. It was the validation he craved. He had chosen fire over comfort, ambition over-obligation. He told himself he was happy, but guilt is a persistent ghost. It would find him in the quiet moments. He'd be in a meeting, and an image of Lillian's devastated face would flash in his mind. He'd wake up in the middle of the night in a cold sweat, the echo of her whispered words, "I'm pregnant," reverberating in the sterile darkness of his new bedroom. He'd push the thoughts away, burying them under more work, more champagne, more of Morin's consuming presence. He was running from a memory, but the faster he ran, the more it seemed to pursue him. Miles away, Lillian was building a different kind of life. Her small apartment was slowly becoming a home. She unpacked her books, hung her favorite prints, and bought a comfortable rocking chair for the second bedroom, which she was turning into a nursery. The first few weeks were brutally hard. Morning sickness was relentless, and the loneliness at night was a physical weight. Her savings were dwindling faster than she'd anticipated. Pride was a luxury she could no longer afford. She reached out to a contact at a small, independent art gallery. The owner, a kind, older woman named Eleanor, remembered Lillian's sharp eye and reputation. She couldn't offer a full-time curator position, but she hired her as a part-time consultant, helping to source and appraise pieces from emerging artists. The work was a balm for her soul. It reconnected her to a part of herself she thought was lost forever. Walking through the quiet gallery, discussing the nuance of brush strokes and color palettes, she felt a sense of purpose return. She started attending prenatal yoga classes where she met other expectant mothers. They talked about cravings and fears, stretch marks and strollers. In their shared experience, she found a quiet community. She was no longer just Jonathan Adams's discarded wife. She was Lillian Brooks, an art consultant, a mother-to-be. She was struggling and she was scared, but with every passing day, a quiet, resilient strength grew within her, solid and real. It was a strength forged in heartbreak, and it was entirely her own. The gloss of Jonathan and Morin's romance began to wear thin. Morin, having secured her place by his side, started to push for more. She wanted the ultimate merger. Marriage. "When are you going to put a ring on my finger, John?" she'd ask, half joking but with a sharp, serious edge. "The divorce isn't even finalized. People are talking. It's being handled," he'd say dismissively, but her words pricked at his unease. Morin grew increasingly possessive. She resented any mention of his past, however indirect. Once, he'd absently picked up a baby sweater in a department store window, his thoughts drifting. Morin had yanked his arm away. "What are you looking at that for? Don't tell me you're actually thinking about it." The baby was the unspoken wedge between them. To Morin, the unborn child was a loose end, a permanent, living link to the woman she had displaced. She saw it as a threat to her claim on him. To Jonathan, the baby was a growing knot of guilt in his gut. He tried to compartmentalize it, to treat it as a financial obligation to be managed by his lawyers, but it wasn't working. Their arguments became more frequent. The thrilling fire of their affair was becoming a draining, consuming blaze. He started to see a desperate insecurity beneath Morin's confident exterior. She hadn't just wanted him, she wanted his life, his status, his power. And she was terrified that the ghost of his past and the reality of his future child could take it all away. The realization was unsettling. He had blown up his life for a passion that was starting to feel as hollow as the penthouse he'd abandoned. It had been 3 months. 3 months of court-mandated silence as the lawyers hashed out the financials of the divorce. He had agreed to a generous settlement, a guilt tax, he'd called it privately. But he hadn't spoken a single word to Lillian. He had no idea how she was, where she was living, or what she was doing. He only knew she hadn't contested the divorce. The not knowing began to eat at him. Was she okay? Was the baby okay? He tried to rationalize his distance. She needs space. Contact would only hurt her more. But he knew it was a coward's excuse. He was afraid to face her, afraid of the judgment in her eyes, afraid of the man she would see when she looked at him. One night, he was alone. Maureen was at a tech gala he couldn't bring himself to attend. He sat in his sterile condo, the silence pressing in on him. He pulled out his phone and stared at Lillian's contact name. His finger hovered over the call button. He thought of her collapse into the sofa, of the cruel things he'd said. "Are you trying to trap me?" The memory made his stomach churn with self-loathing. What kind of man was he? He had built an empire on predicting outcomes and managing risk, yet he had been utterly, catastrophically blind to the human cost of his actions. He was going to be a father who had abandoned his child's mother in her moment of greatest vulnerability. The thought was unbearable. His conscience, long suppressed by ambition and denial, screamed at him. He had to know if she was all right. He had to do something. With a trembling finger, Jonathan pressed the call button. It rang once, twice, 3 times, 4, before going to voicemail. Lillian's voice, calm, professional, the one she used for her old gallery work, filled his ear. "You've reached Lillian Brooks. Please leave a message." He hung up without saying anything, a wave of cold dread washing over him. She didn't pick up. Of course, she didn't. Why would she want to talk to him? He tried to tell himself it was nothing. She was probably busy, or sleeping. He waited an hour, pacing the length of his condo, the city lights below seeming to mock his agitation. He called again. Straight to voicemail. Panic, sharp and acidic, began to rise in his throat. This wasn't right. Even if she hated him, Lillian was polite. She would have at least sent a text telling him to leave her alone. The silence felt wrong. It felt dangerous. He called his lawyer. "I need Lillian's address," he said, his voice tight. "Jonathan, I don't think that's a good idea," the lawyer advised, her voice cautious. "The terms of the separation." "I don't care about the terms," he snapped. "Something's wrong. I can feel it. Just send me the address. Now." A minute later, a text message pinged with a street name and apartment number in a part of the city he hadn't been to in years. He grabbed his car keys, his heart hammering against his ribs. He didn't know what he was expecting to find. He just knew he had to go. As he sped through the city streets, leaving his new life in the rearview mirror, he was consumed by a single, terrifying thought. What if he was too late? The apartment building was a modest, 3-story brick structure, a world away from the gleaming towers he was used to. He found her unit on the 2nd floor. He stood before the plain wooden door, his hand raised to knock, but he hesitated. What right did he have to be here? He took a deep breath and knocked lightly. "Lillian?" No answer. He knocked again, louder this time. "Lillian, it's Jonathan. Please just let me know you're okay." Silence. The dread in his gut intensified into full-blown terror. He tried the doorknob. It was unlocked. A primal fear, cold and sharp, shot through him. He pushed the door open and stepped inside. The apartment was small but tidy. Sunlight streamed through a large window, illuminating dust motes dancing in the air. It was filled with her things, her books, her art, a half-finished baby blanket, and knitting needles resting in a basket. A wave of vertigo hit him as he took it all in. This was her life now, a life he had forced upon her. "Lillian," he called out, his voice hoarse. He walked past the small kitchen and into the living room. And then he saw her. She was on the sofa, half lying, half slumped, her head lolling at an unnatural angle. Her skin was waxy and pale, with a bluish tint to her lips. Her hand was resting on her stomach, where a pronounced, unmistakable baby bump was visible beneath her simple cotton dress. For a moment, his brain couldn't process the scene. She looked like a porcelain doll that had been dropped and broken. "Lil?" he whispered, rushing to her side. He touched her arm. It was cold. "Lillian!" He shook her shoulder gently. No response. Her breathing was shallow, barely perceptible. His blood ran cold. He fumbled for his phone, his fingers slick with sweat, and shaking so violently he could barely press the numbers. 911, what is your emergency? My wife, he stammered, the word feeling alien and fraudulent on his tongue. "She's collapsed. She's pregnant. She's not responding. I'm at—" He rattled off the address, his voice cracking with a terror so profound it felt like it was tearing him apart from the inside. In that moment, standing over the motionless body of the woman he had so callously discarded, Jonathan Adams, the billionaire titan, was utterly, devastatingly broken. The wail of the ambulance siren was a sound Jonathan would never forget. He followed it to the hospital in a daze, the short drive feeling like an eternity. He was relegated to the waiting room, a sterile beige box where time seemed to warp and stretch. Nurses and doctors bustled past, their faces grimly professional, ignoring the frantic, disheveled man in the expensive suit. He was no longer a CEO. He was just another terrified person waiting for news. Hours crawled by. He replayed the scene in her apartment over and over in his mind. Her pale face, the unnatural stillness, the curve of her belly. He had done this. His cruelty, his neglect, it had led to this. The empire he built felt like a pile of ashes. The thrill of his affair with Moran seemed like a sick, childish fantasy. Finally, a doctor with tired eyes and a kind face approached him. "Mr. Adams?" Jonathan shot to his feet. "Is she okay? The baby?" "Your wife is stable for now," the doctor began, his tone cautious. "She was suffering from severe dehydration and malnutrition, but the more serious issue is preeclampsia. Her blood pressure is dangerously high. It's a serious complication of pregnancy, often exacerbated by extreme stress." The doctor's gaze was pointed, and Jonathan felt the unspoken accusation like a physical blow. "We've managed to stabilize her, but she and the baby are both in a high-risk situation. We'll be monitoring them very closely. The next 24 hours are critical." Jonathan sagged back into his chair. The relief that she was alive immediately swamped by the fear of what could still happen. He had almost lost them both. Because of him. He was powerless, useless. All his money, all his influence, meant nothing in this place. All he could do was wait and pray to a God he hadn't spoken to in years. Late the next afternoon, a nurse informed him that Lillian was awake. His heart leaped into his throat. He followed the nurse to the ICU, his steps hesitant. He stopped in the doorway of her room. She looked small and fragile against the stark white sheets, hooked up to a web of monitors that beeped in a steady, reassuring rhythm. Her eyes fluttered open and found his. For a moment, there was just confusion. Then, as memory returned, her expression hardened. Fear, anger, and a deep, soul-crushing weariness washed over her face. "What are you doing here?" she whispered, her voice raspy. He took a tentative step into the room. "Lillian, I found you. I called the ambulance." He was stammering, the confident, commanding CEO completely gone. "I am so sorry. Sorry?" She cut him off, a spark of fire in her eyes. "You're sorry?" A dry, humorless laugh escaped her raw throat. "You destroy my life. You accuse me of trapping you. You abandon me and your child, and now you're sorry." Each word was a perfectly aimed dart. "I know," he said, his voice thick with shame. There's no excuse. I was a monster. Yes, you were, she said, the simple agreement more damning than any tirade. She turned her head away from him, looking toward the window. Please leave, she said, her voice flat and final. I don't want you here. Her rejection was a blade to the heart. But he knew he deserved it. He deserved so much more. He backed out of the room without another word, the beeping of the machines echoing his own frantic, broken heartbeat. He drove back to his condo in a stupor. When he walked in, Maureen was there, her arms crossed, her face a mask of fury. Where have you been? She demanded. Your phone has been off. You missed the gala. You disappeared all night. I find out from a gossip site that you were seen at a hospital. Were you with her? The venom in her voice, the selfish indignation. It was like a splash of cold water to his face. He looked at her, at the beautiful, ambitious woman he had chosen, and he felt nothing but revulsion. He saw not a partner, but the co-architect of his destruction. Yes, he said, his voice flat. I was with Lillian. She collapsed. She's in the hospital. She and the baby. They almost died. Maureen's face barely flickered with concern. Her anger quickly morphed into paranoid jealousy. Oh, how convenient. She collapses right when the divorce is about to be finalized. Are you really falling for this, John? The same accusation he had thrown at Lillian. Hearing it from Maureen's lips, aimed at a woman lying in an ICU bed, was monstrous. In that moment, the entire artifice of their relationship crumbled into dust. It wasn't love or passion. It was a transaction, a toxic symbiosis of ambition and ego. Get out, Jonathan said, his voice dangerously quiet. What? Maureen stared at him, incredulous. I said, get out, he repeated, his voice rising with a cold fury he hadn't felt before. It wasn't the anger of a frustrated CEO. It was the roar of a man who had finally seen the depths of his own moral bankruptcy. This was a mistake. All of it. You, me, this hollow life. It's over. Pack your things and go. Their ensuing fight was epic and ugly, filled with recriminations and bitter truths. But Jonathan's resolve was absolute. He had chosen the wrong person, the wrong life, for the wrong reasons. He had to start making things right. And it started with this, ending the lie. When Maureen finally stormed out, slamming the door behind her, the silence that followed wasn't empty. It was the sound of rock bottom. It was the sound of a space being cleared for something new. Jonathan returned to the hospital the next day, not to see Lillian, but to speak with her doctors. He needed to know what she needed. As he stood in the hallway, a blur of righteous fury accosted him. It was Chloe, Lillian's friend. You, she hissed, jabbing a finger into his chest. You have some nerve showing your face here. Jonathan didn't defend himself. He didn't make excuses. He just stood there and took it, his face a portrait of shame. You're right, he said quietly. Everything you're thinking is right. I deserve it. His lack of defense seemed to surprise her, momentarily deflating her anger. What do you want, Jonathan? I want to help, he said, his voice raw with sincerity. I don't want her to see me. I want to make sure she has everything she needs, the best doctors, a private room, anything. And when she gets out, I don't want her to have to worry about money. Ever. He met with the hospital's financial administrator and paid for everything up front. Then he called his lawyer with a new set of instructions. Not to finalize a divorce settlement, but to set up an irrevocable trust fund for Lillian and the child. He structured it so the payments would come through a third-party firm, anonymously. He didn't want her gratitude or her forgiveness. He just wanted her and his child to be safe. It was the first truly selfless thing he had done in years, and though it didn't lessen his guilt, it was a first tentative step on the long road toward penance. A week later, Lillian was stable enough to be moved from the ICU to a private room, a luxury she hadn't requested and couldn't explain. She knew it had to be Jonathan. When he requested, through a nurse, to speak with her for 5 minutes, she reluctantly agreed. She needed to set boundaries. He entered the room hesitantly, looking thinner, older. The arrogant swagger was gone, replaced by a quiet, heavy humility. They didn't talk about their relationship. There wasn't one to talk about. They talked about the baby. "I want to be a father to this child," he said, his voice steady but soft. "If you'll let me." Lillian looked at him, her gaze clear and unwavering. The ordeal had stripped away her naivete, replacing it with a core of steel. "This isn't about what you want anymore, Jonathan. It's about what this baby needs, and what I will allow." The negotiation was tense. She laid out her terms with the precision of a lawyer. He would have no legal custody, not at first. He would have supervised visitation rights. He would not be present at the birth unless she explicitly invited him. All decisions about the baby's health, education, and upbringing would be hers. She would accept the financial support from the anonymous trust. She knew it was him, because she wouldn't let her pride harm her child's future. But it didn't buy him access or forgiveness. He agreed to every single condition without a moment's hesitation. There was no argument, no negotiation from his side. His only request was simple. "What are you going to name her?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper. Lillian paused, her hand resting on her stomach. "I was thinking of Hope," she said. His eyes filled with tears, and he nodded, unable to speak. Hope. It was something he had destroyed, and something she had managed to find in the wreckage. The baby, Hope, was born 6 weeks prematurely, small but fierce, and, against all odds, healthy. Lillian's labor was sudden and difficult. In a moment of fear and exhaustion, she had allowed the nurse to call him. Jonathan arrived at the hospital just as the baby was being born. He waited outside the delivery room, hearing that first miraculous cry. A nurse eventually emerged, smiling, and told him he could come in. Lillian was exhausted, but radiant, holding the tiny, swaddled bundle in her arms. She looked at Jonathan, her expression unreadable. After a long moment, she nodded toward the baby. "Do you want to hold her?" His hands trembled as he reached for his daughter. He was terrified he would drop her, that he would break something so perfect and fragile. The moment the tiny 7-pound weight of his daughter settled into his arms, his world shifted on its axis. He looked down at her perfect, miniature face, her tuft of dark hair, her tiny fingers curled around his. A sob escaped him, a raw, guttural sound of grief, regret, and overwhelming love. This was real. More real than any business deal, any penthouse, any fleeting passion. This was his daughter, and he had almost lost her before he even knew her. He wept openly, tears of profound sorrow and profound gratitude streaming down his face. Lillian watched him, and for the first time in a long time, the anger in her heart softened, just a little, into something that resembled pity, and perhaps a microscopic seed of grace. The months that followed were a quiet testament to change. Jonathan proved his commitment not with grand gestures or desperate apologies, but with steady, reliable action. He never missed a scheduled visitation. He showed up on time, every time, with diapers, formula, or whatever Lillian had mentioned they needed. He sold Nexus Innovations, a move that shocked the financial world. He explained it away as wanting to pursue smaller, more meaningful ventures. But the truth was simpler. The empire no longer mattered. It was the symbol of the man he used to be, and he was desperate to leave that man behind. He sold the audacious condo and bought a modest, comfortable house in a quiet suburb near Lillian, with a backyard and space for a swing set. He baby-proofed the entire house before Hope could even crawl. He respected every single one of Lillian's boundaries. He never overstayed his welcome. He never pushed for more. He was simply there, a constant, steady presence in his daughter's life. He learned to change a diaper, to warm a bottle, to recognize the difference between a hungry cry and a tired cry. He discovered the simple, profound joy of his daughter falling asleep on his chest. He was learning, day by day, how to be a father. One Tuesday evening, Jonathan arrived at Lillian's apartment for his scheduled visit. He found the door slightly ajar and could hear Hope crying inconsolably from inside. He let himself in and found Lillian pacing the living room, her face etched with exhaustion, bouncing a wailing Hope in her arms. "I'm sorry," she said, her voice frayed. "She's teething. Nothing is working. She's been like this for hours." Jonathan didn't say a word. He just walked over, put his hands out, and Lillian, without hesitation, handed the baby over. He held Hope against his shoulder, murmuring softly to her, and rocking her with a gentle, steady rhythm he'd perfected over the last few months. Within minutes, her frantic cries subsided into whimpers, and then silence. She was asleep. He gently laid her in her crib. When he returned to the living room, Lillian was slumped on the sofa, her head in her hands. He went into her small kitchen, put the kettle on, and made her a cup of chamomile tea, just the way she used to like it. He placed it on the coffee table in front of her. She looked up, her eyes expressing a gratitude that words couldn't capture. "Thank you," she whispered. He simply nodded and sat in the armchair opposite her. They sat in silence for a long time. It wasn't an awkward silence, or a tense one. It was a comfortable, shared quiet, the kind that can only exist between two people who have been through a war together and survived. It was the first time since the night he'd left that they had simply existed in the same room. Not as adversaries, not as exes, but as two tired parents united by their love for their child. A year later, on a sunny Saturday afternoon, Jonathan and Lillian stood in a park. Between them, a little girl with a head full of dark curls and her mother's determined eyes took a shaky step, then another, a wide, gummy smile on her face. Hope wobbled from her mother's outstretched hands toward her father's. Jonathan scooped her up, burying his face in her hair, breathing in the sweet scent of her. "You did it!" he cheered, his voice filled with a pure, uncomplicated joy. He looked over at Lillian, who was watching them with a soft smile. The scars of his betrayal were still there, faint lines on the landscape of their lives. They would never fade completely. The romantic love they once shared was a ghost, a memory from another lifetime. But in its place, something new and arguably stronger had grown. It was a partnership, forged in crisis and tempered by forgiveness. It was a deep, abiding respect built on actions, not words. He was no longer the ruthless millionaire, and she was no longer the heartbroken wife. He was a father. She was a mother. They were a family, redefined. As he set Hope down to let her explore a dandelion, his hand brushed Lillian's. It wasn't a romantic touch, but a simple, human connection. A shared acknowledgement of the beautiful, precious thing they had built from the wreckage. Redemption, he finally understood, wasn't about getting back what you had lost. It was about having the grace to build something new. Jonathan and Lillian's story is a powerful reminder that our worst mistakes don't have to define our future. It's a story about the painful, messy, but ultimately beautiful process of earning a second chance. What did you think of Jonathan's path to redemption? Could you forgive him if you were in Lillian's shoes? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. If this story touched your heart, please give it a like. Share it with someone who might need to hear it. And don't forget to subscribe for more powerful real-life stories about love, loss, and the strength of the human spirit. She was a 22-year-old waitress, drowning in debt and forgotten dreams, serving coffee in a greasy spoon diner. He was a reclusive millionaire, a man who could buy anything in the world, but happiness haunted by a ghost from his past. When his most prized possession vanished from his table, he didn't hesitate to accuse her, to threaten her entire livelihood. But with her world crumbling, she looked the most powerful man she'd ever met in the eye and spoke 5 words that would change everything. Check the security footage. She thought it would prove her innocence. She never imagined that the very next day, a $500,000 Rolls-Royce would be waiting for her outside her run-down apartment. This isn't a story about a misunderstanding. It's about what the camera saw that no one else did, and how a secret buried for 50 years was about to erupt and change 2 lives forever. The scent of stale coffee and hot grease was the perfume of Clara Jenkins's life. At 22, she moved through the narrow aisles of the Daily Grind, a diner permanently stuck in a sepia-toned photograph of the 1970s, with the practiced, weary grace of a soldier navigating a familiar trench. Her dreams of charcoal sketches and gallery openings were buried under layers of student loan debt and her mother's mounting medical bills. Each plate of lukewarm eggs Benedict she delivered, each sticky table she wiped down, was a shovelful of dirt on that grave. Her apron, once a crisp white, now bore a Jackson Pollock-esque collection of stains, a dash of ketchup here, a smear of mustard there, a ghostly ring from a coffee cup placed carelessly on her pocket. It was a canvas of her servitude. That Tuesday began like any other. The morning rush was a symphony of clattering plates and shouted orders, conducted by Brenda, the diner's owner, a woman whose heart was as warm as her temper was short. Clara was in the weeds, juggling 3 tables, one of which was the dreaded Booth 4. Booth 4 was the self-proclaimed throne of Mr. Callum Drake. Callum Drake was a ghost who haunted the world of the living. Once a titan of industry, a name whispered with reverence in boardrooms, he had vanished from public life 5 years ago, after the death of his wife Eleanor. Now he was a creature of rigid habit. Every Tuesday and Thursday at precisely 9:00 a.m., his severe black Bentley would pull up to the curb, and he would emerge a tall, gaunt figure dressed in an impeccably tailored but somber suit that seemed to absorb the light around him. He was not a pleasant customer. He demanded his coffee black hot and filled to a specific line just below the brim. His toast had to be the color of pale almond, and his newspaper, the Financial Times, had to be folded crisply beside his plate, not touching it. Any deviation was met with a glacial stare from his pale blue eyes, a look that could curdle cream. Clara, being the most senior waitress, had inherited the honor of serving him. It was a trial by fire, a weekly test of her patience. On this particular Tuesday, the storm broke. A family with 3 sugar-fueled children had just left, leaving a sticky battlefield of syrup and half-eaten pancakes. As Clara rushed to clear the debris, a toddler's discarded toy, a small plastic dinosaur, skittered under her feet. She stumbled, her balance lost for a critical second. The fresh, scalding hot coffee she was carrying for Mr. Drake sloshed violently. A dark, hot wave crested over the rim of the cup and crashed directly onto the pristine pages of the Financial Times. The diner seemed to fall silent. The usual clatter and chatter died, replaced by a thick, anxious quiet. Clara froze the coffee pot still in her hand, her heart hammering against her ribs. Callum Drake slowly lowered the section of the paper he was reading. His eyes, cold as a winter sky, lifted from the spreading brown stain to fix on her. He didn't shout. He didn't raise his voice. He did something far worse. He spoke in a low, venomous whisper that cut through the silence. "Are you an imbecile?" The words struck Clara like a physical blow. Humiliation, hot and sharp, washed over her. I'm so sorry, sir. It was an accident. I tripped. An accident, he repeated the words, dripping with disdain. He gestured at the ruined paper with a long, slender finger. This is not an accident. This is incompetence. Brenda was already rushing over her face, a mixture of apology and apprehension. "Mr. Drake, I am so sorry." "Clara, get a cloth. We'll get you a new coffee, a new paper, right away. On the house, of course." Drake waved a dismissive hand, not even gracing Brenda with a glance. His focus was entirely on Clara, who was dabbing futilely at the soaked paper with a damp rag. "Leave it. It's ruined." He began to gather his things, his movements stiff with anger. He pulled out a slim alligator leather wallet to pay for the coffee he hadn't drunk. He placed a $50 bill on the table, a clear statement of his displeasure. As he stood, his hand brushed against his waistcoat pocket, a gesture he made a dozen times during any meal. Then he froze. His hand patted the pocket again, more frantically this time. His face, already pale, turned ashen. "Where is it?" he breathed, the question directed at the empty space on the table. Sir Clara asked, her own voice trembling. His head snapped up, and his eyes, now blazing with a terrifying, panicked fire, locked onto hers. "My locket. It's gone." He patted his pockets again, a frantic, desperate search. "It was in my waistcoat pocket. It's always there. It's gone." Brenda stepped forward. "Miss Drake." Perhaps it fell. "Let's look around the booth." But Drake's gaze was cemented on Clara. His mind, conditioned by years of corporate takeovers and hostile negotiations, saw only the most logical, cynical explanation. The clumsy waitress, the distraction, the opportunity. "You," he snarled, pointing a trembling finger at her. "You bumped into me. You spilled the coffee as a distraction." Clara recoiled, as if he had slapped her. "What? No, I tripped." "A likely story. A girl like you working in a place like this. You see a man like me. It must be tempting." The accusation hung in the air, thick and poisonous. The other patrons were now openly staring their breakfasts forgotten. "I am not a thief," Clara said, her voice shaking, but gaining a sliver of steel. The humiliation was hardening into righteous anger. How dare he? How dare he stand there and assassinate her character in front of everyone? It was a silver locket. He pressed on his voice, rising in volume, fueled by a grief and panic that no one in the diner could understand. An antique. It's irreplaceable. "I didn't take your locket, sir." "Then where is it?" he roared, slamming his hand down on the table. The salt and pepper shakers jumped. Brenda tried to intervene again. "Mr. Drake, please let's be reasonable. We can all look for it. Clara has worked for me for 4 years. She's an honest girl." Honest Drake laughed a harsh, ugly sound. "The world is not an honest place. I want you to empty your pockets." This was the ultimate degradation. to be treated like a common criminal. Clara's eyes welled with tears, but she refused to let them fall. She would not give him the satisfaction. She looked past his furious face, past Brenda's worried expression, and up at the small black dome mounted on the ceiling in the corner. The security camera. A spark of defiance ignited within her. Her voice when she spoke was clear and steady, cutting through his tirade. "I will not empty my pockets," she said. Her chin held high. "I am not a thief. You want to know what happened to your locket?" She met his furious gaze without flinching. "Check the security footage." The challenge silenced him. His rage was momentarily eclipsed by surprise at her audacity. He stared at her, this insignificant girl in a stained apron who had dared to stand up to him. Brenda, seeing a way to de-escalate, seized the opportunity. "That's a good idea. Mr. Drake, the footage is time-stamped. We can review it right now." But Drake was too proud, too angry to be placated. To him, her defiance was just another confirmation of her guilt. He sneered. "I don't need to check any footage. I know what happened. You're fired." He spat the words directed at Brenda, but his eyes still locked on Clara. "And if my locket is not returned to my office by the end of the day, I will be filing a police report. For theft." He turned on his heel and stormed out of the diner, leaving a wake of stunned silence and the lingering smell of burnt coffee and baseless accusation. Clara stood frozen, his threat echoing in her ears. Her job, her reputation, her entire fragile existence was about to be shattered. Brenda put a comforting hand on her shoulder, but it barely registered. All Clara could think about was the cold, indifferent eye of the camera on the ceiling, her only witness and her last hope. "Brenda," Clara whispered, her voice cracking. "He can't do that, can he?" Brenda sighed, her expression grim. "A man like Callum Drake can do whatever he wants." She gave Clara's shoulder a squeeze. "Go home for the day, sweetie. I'll have to pull the footage. I'll call you." The words hung in the air. "I'll have to pull the footage." A man like Drake didn't make idle threats. Clara was no longer just a waitress. She was a suspect. She walked out of the diner, the stares of the other customers like daggers in her back, and stepped into the grey afternoon, feeling as if the whole world had just found her guilty. Clara's apartment was a small third-floor walk-up that always smelled faintly of her downstairs neighbour's curry. It was her sanctuary, her studio and her cell. The walls were covered in her own charcoal drawings, expressive portraits, sweeping landscapes, studies of light and shadow. They were evidence of a life she was supposed to be living, a constant painful reminder of the dream she was deferring one cup of coffee at a time. She spent the rest of the day in a daze of anxiety. Every creak of the floorboards, every siren in the distance sent a jolt of fear through her. She imagined police officers knocking at her door, the shame of being led away in handcuffs. Her mother. What would this do to her mother? The stress alone could set her recovery back months. She replayed the scene in the diner 100 times, her own voice sounding bold and foreign to her. Check the security footage. Had it been brave or just foolish? What if the camera angle was bad? What if it didn't show anything clearly? What if by some impossible twist of fate the locket had fallen into her apron pocket without her realizing? She frantically checked her hands, trembling, but found only a crumpled napkin and a lip balm. Sleep offered no escape. She tossed and turned, caught in nightmares where Mr. Drake's face morphed into a judge's, his gavel slamming down as he pronounced her guilty. She awoke the next morning to the pale, watery light of dawn, feeling hollowed out. She checked her phone for the 10th time. Nothing from Brenda. That felt ominous. Surely if the footage had cleared her, Brenda would have called immediately. The silence was a confirmation of her worst fears. She was fired. A police report was probably already filed. The name Clara Jenkins was now synonymous with thief. She dragged herself to the small kitchen to make tea, her movements slow and heavy. As the kettle began to whistle, a strange sound from the street below caught her attention. It wasn't the usual rumble of the city waking up. It was a low, powerful purr, a sound so deep and smooth it seemed to vibrate through the floorboards. Curiosity piqued. She peered through the grimy window of her living room, and her breath caught in her throat. Parked directly in front of her dilapidated apartment building, a magnificent beast of chrome and steel was a Rolls-Royce Phantom. It wasn't just any Rolls-Royce. It was a stunning, bespoke model, its body a deep, lustrous midnight blue that seemed to drink the morning light. It was so out of place on her run-down street that it looked like a spaceship had landed. Her neighbors were already starting to gather on the sidewalk, pointing and whispering. Kids on their way to school stopped to stare, their mouths agape. Clara's first thought was that it was a movie shoot. It was the only logical explanation. But there were no cameras, no crew, no barricades. Just the car idling with an almost silent, intimidating power. Then the driver's door opened. A man in a crisp black chauffeur's uniform stepped out. He was tall and impassive, wearing white gloves. He walked not to the front door of the building, but to the passenger side rear door. He opened it with a quiet, reverent click and stood waiting. For whom Clara wondered. The wealthy tech mogul who lived in the newly renovated penthouse down the block. But the chauffeur was looking up, directly at her window. He seemed to have been waiting for her to appear. He gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod. Clara's heart began to pound, a frantic, bewildering rhythm. This couldn't be Hua. Bimamo. It was impossible, a prank, a mistake. Just then her phone buzzed. She snatched it up, her hands shaking. The screen read, Brenda. Brenda. Oh my God, I've been so worried. Did you see the footage? What happened? Brenda's voice was strained, and there was an undercurrent of awe in it that Clara had never heard before. Clara, I saw it. I saw the whole thing. And it shows I didn't take it right. Clara pleaded. It shows everything, honey. It shows a lot more than that. Brenda paused, and Clara could hear her take a deep breath. Mr. Drake called me last night. Very late. He was different, apologetic. I've never heard him sound like that. So he's not pressing charges. Relief washed over Clara, so potent it made her dizzy. Pressing charges, honey. Well, just look outside your window. I am. There's a Rolls-Royce out there. The whole neighborhood is freaking out, Clara Brenda said slowly, enunciating each word carefully. That car is for you. Clara sank onto the arm of her worn-out sofa, the phone nearly slipping from her grasp. That's insane. Why, he wouldn't tell me everything. He just said he was wrong. Terribly, horribly wrong. And he said the camera showed him something he had been blind to for years. He wants to see you, Clara. He wants to apologize in person. That car is waiting to take you to his home. Clara stared at the impossible car, at the impassive chauffeur, standing like a statue beside it. This was happening. This was real. Yesterday she was an accused thief on the verge of ruin. Today, a chariot of the gods was waiting at her curb. The two events were so cosmically disparate that they didn't make sense. An apology for a false accusation. A man like Callum Drake didn't send a Rolls-Royce to say, "I'm sorry." He might send a check, a curtly worded letter from his lawyer. This was something else entirely. The camera showed him something he had been blind to for years. Brenda's words echoed in her mind. What could the security camera possibly have shown him? A grainy, black-and-white video of a clumsy waitress and a chaotic diner. It made no sense. Fear and curiosity warred within her. The offer was terrifying. A trip to the lion's den. But what was the alternative? To hide in her apartment, forever wondering to refuse, would be to slam the door on the one thing that could explain the surreal turn her life had just taken. Taking a deep, shuddering breath, she made a decision. She would face the lion. "Tell the driver," she said to Brenda, her voice barely a whisper. "I'll be down in 5 minutes." She hung up the phone and walked to her closet, her mind racing. What do you wear to meet the millionaire who tried to ruin your life and then sent a Rolls-Royce to fetch you? Her wardrobe consisted of jeans, t-shirts, and her waitress uniform. She settled on her one good outfit, a simple black dress she'd bought for a community art show 2 years ago. It was modest and clean. It would have to do. As she walked down the creaking stairs of her building, she felt the eyes of her neighbors on her. Mrs. Gable from 2B, who always complained about her music, peeked out her door, her eyes wide. The kids on the landing fell silent. It was a walk of fame and a walk of shame all at once. She pushed open the front door and stepped into the morning air. The chauffeur, whose name she would learn was Arthur, inclined his head. "Miss Jenkins?" he asked, his voice a polite, low baritone. She nodded, unable to speak. He held the door open for her. She slid on to the plush leather seat, which was softer than her own mattress. The door closed with a silent, satisfying thud, sealing her off from the world she knew. The murmuring of her neighbors, the sounds of the city, all of it vanished, replaced by an opulent, unnerving silence, as the magnificent car pulled away from the curb, as smoothly as a ship leaving port. Clara looked back at her small, insignificant apartment building. She had a strange, powerful feeling that she wasn't just leaving for a meeting. She was leaving a part of her life behind, forever. She was driving into the heart of a mystery, and she was terrified of what she might find. The journey was a silent 20-minute glide through a world Clara had only ever seen in magazines. The gritty urban landscape of her neighborhood dissolved into tree-lined avenues and then into the manicured palatial grandeur of the city's most exclusive enclave. The car turned into a long, winding driveway, hidden from the road by a towering stone wall and a formidable wrought-iron gate that opened silently as they approached. Callum Drake didn't live in a house. He lived in a museum. It was a sprawling Georgian-style mansion of pale stone surrounded by acres of immaculate gardens that looked as though each blade of grass had been individually trimmed. It was beautiful, but it was a cold-lonely beauty. There were no children's toys on the lawn, no signs of life, just a perfect, sterile order. Arthur opened her door and led her up a grand stone staircase to a front door that was at least 12 feet high. It swung open before he could touch it, revealing a stern-looking woman in a grey dress, the housekeeper. "Miss Jenkins," the woman said, her voice devoid of emotion. "Mr. Drake is waiting for you in the West Gallery." Clara followed her through a cavernous foyer with a marble floor and a chandelier that looked like a cascade of frozen diamonds. The air was cool and smelled of lemon polish and old books. Their footsteps echoed the only sound in the vast, silent house. It felt less like a home and more like a mausoleum. The West Gallery was a long, sun-drenched room with a wall of glass overlooking the gardens. The other 3 walls were filled with art, but it wasn't the kind of corporate abstract art Clara had expected. These were paintings filled with life and color and emotion. There were vibrant landscapes, intimate still lifes, and powerful portraits. It was a stunning collection. Callum Drake stood at the far end of the gallery, his back to her, staring at a large canvas that hung in a place of honor above a marble fireplace. He was dressed in the same dark suit, but he seemed smaller today, less imposing, without the armor of his anger. He turned as she entered, and for the first time Clara saw something other than cold fury in his eyes. There was exhaustion, regret, and a deep, profound sadness. "Miss Jenkins." "Clara," he said, his voice quiet. "Thank you for coming. Please." He gestured to 2 plush armchairs near the fireplace. She sat stiffly on the edge of the seat, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. The housekeeper vanished as silently as she had appeared. "I imagine you are confused," he began, forgoing the chair and remaining on his feet. "That would be one word for it," Clara replied, her voice steady, despite the hammering of her heart. He gave a small, wry smile that didn't reach his eyes. "First and most importantly, I must offer you my most profound and sincere apology. My behavior yesterday was inexcusable. It was vile. I accused you of something you did not want to do, and I publicly humiliated you. There is no excuse for it, but there is a reason, and I owe you that explanation." He walked over to a small table and picked up a silver object that glinted in the light. "The locket. This belonged to my wife, Eleanor," he said, his voice growing thick with emotion. "She passed away 5 years ago. This locket, it was the first gift I ever bought her when I had nothing. Before all this," he gestured vaguely at the opulent room. "It's the most valuable thing I own. When I thought it was gone..." He trailed off, shaking his head. I reacted out of grief and panic. I saw a target and I lashed out. It was a monstrous thing to do, and I am truly deeply sorry." He placed the locket back on the table. "Brenda suspended you on my instruction. I called her last night and corrected that. Your job is safe, and I have sent the diner a check to compensate for the disturbance and to cover your wages for the next year as a preliminary apology. A year's wages." Clara felt a wave of dizziness. That was more money than she had seen in her entire life. It would pay off a huge chunk of her loans. It would mean she could finally get her mother the better care she needed. "But that's not why I asked you here," he continued, his tone shifting. He turned his gaze back to the large painting above the fireplace. "I asked you here because of what I saw on the security footage." Clara leaned forward. "What did you see? Did you see who took it?" "Oh yes," he said dismissively. "The camera was perfectly clear. As you were tending to another table, one of the busboys, Marco, I believe, saw the locket fall from my pocket when I stood. He covered it with a napkin and pocketed it when he cleared the table. I have dealt with that matter. My security team retrieved the locket from a pawn shop this morning. But that's not what I'm talking about." He paused, taking a deep breath. "My security chief sent the footage to my personal computer. It was high definition, crystal clear. I was looking for the thief. But then I saw you. He pointed a remote at a large screen hidden behind a panelled wall which slid open silently. The security footage flickered to life. There was the diner in grainy but sharp detail. There was Drake himself storming out. And there was Clara standing alone for a moment in the wake of his fury. "Watch," he said softly. On the screen, Clara, looking utterly defeated, leaned against the counter. She pulled a small, worn sketchbook and a piece of charcoal from her apron pocket, a habit she had to sketch during her short, infrequent breaks. For just 30 seconds before Brenda came over, her hand moved across the page, her face a mask of concentration. The camera, positioned almost directly above her, had a clear view of the paper. She was sketching the face of an old man at the counter, capturing his weary expression with a few deft strokes. "My God," Callum whispered, staring at the screen. He wasn't talking to Clara. He was reliving the moment he first saw it. He froze the frame, then zoomed in the image, pixelating slightly. But the details were still clear. The confident lines, the understanding of light and shadow, the raw emotion captured in the sketch. "Your drawing," he said, his voice filled with a strange reverence. "The style, the technique, the soul in it." He turned off the screen and looked at her, his eyes boring into hers. "Where did you learn to draw like that?" Clara was bewildered. This was the big reveal. That he liked her art. I've been drawing my whole life. I took some classes in community college before I had to drop out. Mostly I taught myself. "No," he said, shaking his head. "Someone must have taught you. A parent, a grandparent." Clara frowned. "My father was an accountant. My mother is a nurse. No one in my immediate family is an artist. My grandmother, my mother's mother, she used to draw with me when I was very little. She was the one who gave me my first sketchbook. But she passed away when I was 7. Callum's expression was intense, a complex mixture of hope and fear. "Your grandmother? What was her name?" "Rosemary," Clara said. "Rosemary Jenkins." Callum Drake didn't react, but a subtle tension entered his frame. He turned and walked slowly toward the painting above the fireplace. Clara now saw it properly for the first time. It was a portrait of a beautiful woman with kind, intelligent eyes and a gentle smile. She was seated in a garden bathed in golden light. The style of the painting, the bold brushwork, the emotional depth, the way the light fell was breathtaking and terrifyingly familiar. It was like looking at a fully realized professional version of her own work. The artistic DNA was identical. "This," Callum said, his voice cracking slightly, "is my Eleanor, my late wife. She painted this. It was her last self-portrait before we were married." Clara stood up and walked closer, her heart pounding. She felt a strange connection to the woman in the painting, a ghost of a memory, a whisper of a forgotten song. "Before she met me," Callum continued, his voice heavy with a guilt that seemed ancient, "Eleanor was an artist, a brilliant one. But her family was old money, very traditional. They disapproved. They wanted her to marry well, to be a socialite. When she chose me, I was nobody, then just a brash upstart with more ambition than sense. They gave her an ultimatum. Her art or me." He looked at the painting with infinite sadness. She chose me, and she never painted again. It was the great tragedy of her life and my greatest regret. He turned back to Clara, his eyes glistening with unshed tears. For 50 years, I thought her artistic spirit had died with that choice. I thought it was gone from the world forever. And then yesterday on a security camera, in a greasy spoon diner, I saw it again. I saw her ghost. In your hand. In your sketchbook. The pieces of the puzzle were falling into place, but they were forming a picture so impossible, so earth-shattering that Clara's mind struggled to accept it. Your grandmother Rosemary Callum, said his voice, barely a whisper. Did she ever speak of a sister? An older sister she lost touch with. Clara searched the dusty archives of her childhood memories. Vague images surfaced. Her grandmother, sitting on the porch, sketching in a book, a sad look on her face. A story she once told a very young Clara about having a sister who went away to live in a castle. Clara had always assumed it was a fairy tale. I think so, Clara stammered. She said she had a sister. A long time ago. They had a fight, a family argument. She never saw her again. Callum Drake closed his eyes, and a single tear finally escaped, tracing a path through the weathered lines of his face. Eleanor's maiden name was not Drake, he said, his voice trembling with the weight of a 50-year-old revelation. It was Maxwell, but the name she was born with, the name her estranged younger sister Rosemary would have known her by, was Eleanor Jenkins. The world tilted on its axis. The silent, opulent room seemed to rush in on Clara. Eleanor, Rosemary, Jenkins. The fairy tale was real. The woman in the painting, the brilliant artist, the lost love of this powerful broken man, was her great-aunt. The artistic talent she thought was hers alone was a legacy, an inheritance of the soul passed down from a sister to a sister, and then to that sister's grandchild. The Rolls-Royce, the mansion, the apology. It wasn't about a locket. It was about a ghost. Callum Drake hadn't just found his wife's lost possession. He had found a living, breathing piece of her lost soul. He had found Clara. The revelation hung in the air, as heavy and as fragile as the crystal chandelier above them. Clara sank back into the armchair, her mind a whirlwind. Her grandmother had a sister, a famous, wealthy sister she had never known. The art that flowed from her fingers was a current that had run through her family's hidden history. Callum, meanwhile, seemed to be grappling with his own tidal wave of emotions. He paced the gallery, running a hand through his thinning grey hair. He was a man who had controlled markets, built empires, and bent the world to his will. But he was utterly adrift in the face of this fragile human connection to his past. I need to think. He murmured more to himself than to Clara. This changes things. This changes everything. It was at that moment that a new voice, sharp and laced with aristocratic condescension, cut through the charged atmosphere. Father, what is going on here? My office has been calling you all morning. They said you cancelled the quarterly acquisitions meeting for this. A young man stood in the doorway of the gallery. He was handsome, in a severe, polished way, in his early 30s with his father's height, but none of his weathered gravitas. He was dressed in a suit that was even more expensive than Callum's, but he wore it like a uniform of entitlement. This was Felix Drake, Callum's only son, and the heir to the Drake empire. Felix's eyes swept the room, taking in his father's disheveled state and then landing on Clara. He scanned her simple black dress, her worn-out shoes, and his lip curled in a faint, almost imperceptible sneer. He saw a waitress in a palace, and his mind leaped to the most obvious and cynical conclusion. Don't tell me Felix said, a mocking edge to his voice. This is the little thief from the diner I heard about the commotion you caused yesterday. I can't believe you brought her here. Are you paying her off? I hope you're not being too generous. Callum's head snapped up, his grief-stricken demeanor vanishing in a flash, replaced by a cold fury that Clara recognized from the diner. That is enough, Felix. Enough, Felix scoffed, stepping further into the room. Father, you've been erratic for years, but this is a new level. First you have a public meltdown over a trinket. Then you send the bloody family Rolls-Royce, the one mother loved, to pick up this girl from some slum. And now you're having tea with her. Have you lost your mind? Is she threatening to go to the papers? Her name is Clara Jenkins. Callum said, his voice dangerously low. And she is a guest in this house. You will show her respect. Respect. Felix laughed, a short, ugly bark. She's a gold digger, father. It's the oldest trick in the book. 'Cause a scene play the victim and then squeeze the guilt-ridden old man for all he's worth. How much does she want? 10,020. Just pay her and get her out of our lives. Clara, who had been sitting in stunned silence, felt a hot surge of anger. The same sense of righteous indignation she'd felt during the accusation in the diner returned tenfold. She stood up, her small frame radiating a surprising intensity. I don't want your money, Mr. Drake, she said, her voice clear and cutting, addressing Felix directly. And for the record, your father invited me here. Felix turned his dismissive gaze on her. Oh, I'm sure he did. My father, since my mother died, has a weakness for lost causes. Felix, I am warning you, Callum thundered. But Clara held up a hand, stopping him. She would fight her own battles. She looked Felix square in the eye. This has nothing to do with money. This is about family. Felix's sneer deepened. Family? Are you claiming to be a long-lost cousin now? The story gets better and better. Let me guess, your sob story is that. Your great-grandfather was a stable boy on the Drake estate. No, Clara said calmly, though her heart was hammering. My grandmother was Rosemary Jenkins. Her sister was Eleanor Jenkins. Your mother. The silence that followed was absolute. Felix's smug expression faltered, his face slackening with disbelief, which quickly curdled back into suspicion. He looked from Clara's defiant face to his father's pained one. That's absurd, Felix stammered. Mother was an only child. No, Callum said, his voice heavy with the weight of old secrets. She wasn't. She had a younger sister, Rosemary. They were estranged long before I met Eleanor. After a terrible argument with their parents, Rosemary left home with nothing. Eleanor was forbidden from contacting her. It was a source of great pain for her entire life. Felix stared at his father, his meticulously ordered world beginning to fracture. You never told me. Eleanor made me promise, Callum said sadly. It was too painful for her to speak of. She felt she had abandoned her sister. She chose me, and in doing so she lost her. It was a sin of omission. I am as guilty of as she was. Felix turned his glare back to Clara, his mind now racing to reframe the situation, not as a fairy tale, but as a sophisticated con. This is a lie. A well-researched, despicable lie. How could you possibly prove such a ridiculous claim? The art, Callum said simply. He gestured to Eleanor's self-portrait, and then to the large screen, which still showed the frozen image of Clara's sketch. Look at it, Felix. The line work, the spirit. It's the same. It is a gift passed down through their bloodline. Felix glanced at the images, but his cynicism was a shield, a talented forger, a lucky coincidence. People can be taught to mimic a style. This is a scam, Father. Can't you see it? She found out about some obscure family history, perhaps from some old public record, and she's exploiting it. She's playing on your grief. The accusation was poisonous. It sought to twist the most beautiful, miraculous discovery of Callum's recent life into something dirty and calculated. Clara felt a wave of despair. How could she prove it? Her word against his. A family resemblance in art was subjective, not hard evidence. But then a memory surfaced, a concrete object, the sketchbooks. She said suddenly. Callum and Felix both looked at her. My grandmother Clara explained, her mind racing. When she died, my mother packed away a few of her things. I was so young, but I remember a box. It had her old sketchbooks in it. My mother saved them for me. They're in a storage locker. Callum's eyes lit up with a renewed fire. Get them, he said, his voice urgent. Arthur will take you. Whatever you need. Felix let out an exasperated sigh. Father, you are not sending her off in the Rolls-Royce again, to fetch some box of mouldy old drawings. This is madness. This is not madness, Felix. This is my one chance to right a 50-year-old wrong. Callum's voice boomed through the gallery, shaking with an intensity Felix had not seen in years. This is for your mother, for Eleanor. While you've been busy building your own little empire on the foundations, I laid you've forgotten what this family was built on. It was built on love, a love that I forced your mother to make a terrible choice for. If this girl, this family is a consequence of that choice, then I will move heaven and earth to make it right. The force of his father's conviction stunned Felix into silence. He saw a passion in Callum that had long been dormant, a fire lit not by a corporate merger, but by a waitress's sketch. It was a power he didn't understand and couldn't control, and it frightened him. Callum turned to Clara, his expression softening. Go, Clara. Please, bring the sketchbooks. As Arthur escorted Clara from the gallery, back through the silent marble halls, she could hear the raised voices of the father and son echoing behind her. How could you be so naive? Felix's voice dripped with contempt. And how could you be so cynical? Callum's voice retorted, full of weary disappointment. You have your mother's eyes, but you have none of her heart. Clara slid back into the plush leather of the Rolls-Royce, the argument fading behind her. The initial shock and wonder of the morning were now tangled with a new bitter reality. She hadn't just discovered a family. She had walked into a war. Felix Drake would never accept her. He would see her as a threat to his inheritance, to his identity, to the sanitized memory of his mother. The sketchbooks were no longer just a sentimental link to her grandmother. They were now her evidence, her proof of identity. As the great car purred its way back towards her side of the city, Clara prayed that the fragile, pencil-marked pages, stored away in a dark locker for 15 years, held the truth she so desperately needed. The journey to the storage facility was a silent, anxious blur. The imposing luxury of the Rolls-Royce felt utterly surreal parked beside the rows of stark orange garage doors. In the cool, stale air of Unit 3B, amidst the ghosts of her past packed in cardboard, Clara found them. Tucked inside a plastic tote labeled Rosemary's things were 3 thick leather-bound sketchbooks. Their covers were worn smooth with a lifetime of use. She carried them back to the car, as if they were sacred texts. She was escorted not to the gallery, but to a warm, richly appointed library where a fire crackled in the hearth. The change of setting felt intentional, more intimate. Callum stood waiting by a large mahogany desk, his face etched with a desperate hope. Felix was nowhere to be seen, a small mercy that allowed the tension in Clara's shoulders to ease slightly. "May I?" Callum asked, his voice soft as she placed the sketchbooks on the polished wood. Clara simply nodded her throat, too tight for words. With a reverence usually reserved for priceless artifacts, Callum opened the first volume. He turned the age-yellowed pages, his breath catching audibly. Here was the life his wife's sister had lived, rendered in charcoal and pencil. There were sketches of flowers, portraits of neighbors, studies of her own aging hands. The artistic DNA was undeniable, the same empathy in the lines, the same soulfulness Clara recognized in her great-aunt's work and felt in her own. Callum was seeing the lost years, a talent flourishing in quiet dignity, a world away from his own. "It's her," he whispered, tracing a finger over a self-portrait of an older Rosemary, seeing the faint echo of Eleanor in the woman's kind eyes. He moved to the second book, and then the third, completely absorbed. He was a man, piecing together a family history he never knew he had. Then, near the end of the final book, he froze. His entire body went rigid. "My God," he breathed, his voice thick with emotion. He turned the sketchbook around for Clara to see. The drawing was of a charming storybook cottage with a rose trellis climbing its front porch. It was the inscription below it, however, in her grandmother's elegant script, that made the air in the room stand still. "Our promise. Our place someday. E and R." Beneath the inscription was an address, Blackwood Cottage, Lakeview Lane, Ambleside. Clara looked at it, utterly bewildered. "I don't understand. What is it?" Callum looked up, his eyes wide with a staggering revelation. "Blackwood Cottage," he said, his voice trembling. "Before Eleanor and I were married, when her family's pressure was unbearable, we secretly bought a small property in her name. A place she could paint, a place where we could be free from them all. She called it our promise place. We planned to run away there if we had to." He pointed a shaking finger at the sketchbook. "That is the cottage. She must have shown a drawing of it to Rosemary. It wasn't just my secret with Eleanor, it was their secret too. A dream they shared. The proof was absolute. It was more than a shared talent. It was a shared secret, a promise immortalized on a yellowed page. No con artist could have known this. It was a message from the past, a truth delivered across a 50-year divide. As this monumental truth settled between them, the library doors swung open. Felix strode in his face a mask of impatient skepticism. "Father, this farce has gone on long enough. Are you still entertaining this girl's fantasies?" Callum didn't answer. He simply turned the open sketchbook around on the desk, his expression one of quiet, unshakable certainty. "Look." Felix marched forward, his gaze falling upon the drawing. He read the inscription. He saw the address. The color drained from his face. His arrogant posture collapsed as if his strings had been cut. "Blackwood Cottage," he whispered. He knew the name. It was a minor asset in his mother's trust, a property he'd always dismissed, never knowing its profound significance. "Your mother's promise place," Callum said softly. A secret she shared with her sister. A secret now passed down to her sister's granddaughter. Felix stared from the irrefutable proof in the book to Clara's dignified face and then to the tearful conviction in his father's eyes. The intricate web of his cynicism, his arrogant certainty of a scam, was instantly annihilated. He had been wrong, horribly, poisonously wrong. He had guarded a sanitized version of his mother's memory, erasing the very sister whose loss had caused her so much pain. Clara wasn't a threat to his mother's legacy. She was a living, breathing part of it. Shame, hot and sharp, washed over him. He sank into a nearby chair, the proud heir reduced to a humbled son. He began, his voice cracking. He looked directly at Clara, his eyes filled with a genuine, agonizing regret. "Miss Jenkins." "Clara, I was wrong. What I said, what I thought, it was unforgivable. I am so sorry." The apology hung in the charged silence. Before Clara could even process it, Callum's personal phone buzzed on the desk. He glanced at the ID's head of security. "David." He answered, his tone shifting to business. He listened for a moment, his expression hardening into grim lines. "I see. No, do not involve the police. I will handle this myself." "Thank you." He ended the call, his face a mask of grim contemplation. "What is it?" Father Felix asked, sensing the sudden shift. Callum's gaze met Clara's. "It's about Marco, the busboy. His theft of the locket. It wasn't entirely random. It was personal." He took a deep breath. His father was a foreman at a Drake Industries factory. He was laid off during a restructuring I ordered 15 years ago. The man lost everything. According to my head of security, Marco blames me for his father's subsequent death. He saw the locket fall, and he took it. It was a crime of opportunity, born from a long, festering desire for revenge. The story of the faceless thief was suddenly a tragedy. Marco was collateral damage from a long-forgotten business decision. Another ghost from Callum's past, returning to haunt him. The initial incident was reframed no longer a simple theft, but the desperate act of a wounded son. Callum Drake looked at the sketchbook, at his own humbled son, and at the young woman who was the living key to his past. His life was a ledger of broken connections and unintended consequences. His coldness in business had created an enemy. His demands on his wife had shattered her family. His arrogance in a diner had nearly destroyed the one person who could lead him to redemption. He stood a new resolve solidifying in his eyes. He was no longer just a grieving tycoon. He was a man with a chance to atone. "Felix," he said, his voice firm with purpose. "We are going to see this young man, not to punish him, to listen, and to help." Then he turned to Clara, his expression softening into one of profound warmth. "And you, Clara, you are not a guest here. You are home. This family has a debt to yours that can never truly be repaid. But I will spend the rest of my life trying." He gestured around the magnificent library. "This is all just wood and paper. Meaningless. You have brought your great-aunt's spirit back into this house. Now let me help you give your own art to the world." In the firelit library, the three of them were no longer defined by their former roles. They were bound by a complex tapestry of art loss and the improbable, miraculous chance to rebuild. And so a story that began with a spilled coffee and a cruel accusation became a story of redemption, Callum Drake, humbled and changed, didn't just offer Clara money. He offered her a legacy. He established the Eleanor and Rosemary Foundation for the Arts, dedicated to supporting struggling young artists who, like them, had the talent, but not the opportunity. Clara became its first recipient and its guiding voice. Her first solo gallery show featuring her own work alongside the newly discovered paintings of her great-aunt Eleanor was a sensation. Felix's heart opened, became the foundation's fiercest advocate, using his business acumen to help others instead of just himself. The Rolls-Royce that once waited outside Clara's apartment now serves to bring young undiscovered artists to the mansion for mentorship. It's no longer a symbol of power, but of possibility. This story reminds us that beneath the surface of our daily lives, there are invisible threads connecting us in ways we can't even imagine. It shows us that a single moment of choice to be cruel or to be curious, to accuse or to investigate, can change the entire trajectory of our lives. It proves that it's never too late to right a wrong, to heal a family, and to apologize not just with words, but with actions that create a better future. What would you have done if you were in Clara's shoes? Or Callum's? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. If this story of fate, art, and second chances moved you, please give this video a like. Share it with someone who believes in the magic of hidden connections, and be sure to subscribe to our channel for more real-life dramas that prove truth is often more incredible than fiction. Thank you for listening.